Right. My name is Carolyn Glick, and I'll be moderating this panel where we're talking about how Israel is reported on internationally. So, you know, there are a lot of questions about the nature of the reporting on Israel, whether it's different from the reporting on other issues, other countries by the foreign press. What is interesting, what isn't interesting, what is highlighted, what isn't. Is there a narrative that is dictating coverage? If it is it reflective of reality or not? So we have four esteemed journalists and on our panel today. We have Ami Kaufman, who just joined us recently. He's from I-24 News, which I don't know if you're aware of, but it's sort of an English language satellite network that basically, I would say, provides coverage that's similar to the coverage that we get from the Israeli press in Hebrew. We have Judy Maltz from Haaretz, which is a left-leaning paper. We have David Parsons from the, I see you serve as the ICEJ Vice President, and you work for the same paper I do, the Jerusalem Post Christian Edition. And my old friend Chris Mitchell from CBN News is here as well. I think you've been the bureau chief for how many years?
17 years.
That's it, just 17 years. And so why don't I start actually with Judy. You know, there was to talk just a little bit about the narrative, I want to just lead it with an observation. I think it was last year, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas gave a speech to the European Union where he accused Israel of poisoning the wells in the Palestinian Authority. And this statement by him was surprisingly not newsworthy. That is, the newspapers of the West, the mass media organizations of the West really did not highlight this statement. And I'm wondering if you can explain, if you have thoughts from your perspective from Haaretz, why something like this wouldn't have been highlighted or generate significant coverage. What is it about the nature of the coverage of Israel that would, in your view, dictate that this not be a highlighted story?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Yeah. So I think what you're trying to get me to say is because the media is biased against Israel.
I'm not getting you to say anything. I asked you
No,
a question.
I mean, it seems like that's where you're leading with this question. So I'm not going to take the bait. And if you want to ask me, do I think that the foreign media is biased against Israel, I think that I would say generally, there are exceptions. Generally, I think it's pretty fair. Do I think that most foreign reporters in Israel are opposed to the occupation or are opposed to the Israeli government because the Israeli government promotes the occupation and supports the occupation? I think that is probably true. But I think if you took a survey of Israeli reporters, you would find that the vast majority as well are also opposed to the occupation and also don't support the government's position on it.
So no, that's not the question I asked at all.
But I know that's not the question. But I knew where you were getting with your question. So that's my answer.
Okay. So your answer is it wasn't highlighted that Mahmoud Abbas resonated or actually declared allegiance to an ancient blood libel against Jews, saying they were poisoning wells because the international media opposes the occupation? Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't know what the answer is, but I think you're raising that as an example of a bias against Israel when I don't believe there's a bias.
So you don't see that it's bias? I don't mean.
I mean,
to,
you're bringing one incident.
Okay.
You're bringing one incident, and we can probably show incidents on the other side.
Could you bring one on the other side, please?
Not right now, but I'm sure I could find incidents. Let me just
Okay,
think
then
about it.
let's open up the question to the other panelists. Chris, if you were the first person that I asked this question to, how would you relate to the absence of coverage of Mahmoud Abbas's use of blood libel in his speech before the European Union?
What comes to mind, first of all, is something that has been said many times. What comes to mind first is that... Okay. What comes to mind first, I think, is that sometimes this has been said over and over, perhaps, by some and by the Palestinian Authority. And maybe they... well, for one, I think perhaps from the foreign media, they don't think that, they just take that perhaps at face value. For others, I think they have heard things like these kind of blood libels by the Palestinian media, and just say, well, there they go again. I wanted to add, I think, to what Mati said last time. I think that many in the foreign media maybe are not nefarious, but they do subscribe to what they may say as the narrative. And when I came here in 2000, I felt like I had to go through my own education. And I had people like that I would interview, and I felt like I was going to class. Moshe Sharon from the Hebrew University. I had a seminal moment back when I interviewed Yigal Carmon from the Middle East Media Research Institute. And I think that what they have done, I will say Yigal Carmon and Itzamar Marcus, and I wanted to actually show his book. It's called Deception, Betraying the Peace Process. And I think many times in the foreign media, they don't understand necessarily what is said in Arabic. For example, I sat down with Yigal Carmon, and he said, don't listen to what is said in English for consumption for the foreign media, but listen to what's said in Arabic, or what's said in Farsi, or what's said in the different languages of the Middle East, and you get a whole different narrative, you get a whole different perspective. And I think for those covering and understanding the Middle East, they need to listen to what's said in those languages. And I think, and I would like to add too to what Mati said about context. He talked about the regional context, but there's so many other contexts that I think help inform the whole thing of what's going on in the Middle East. The biblical context, the spiritual context, the historical context, the religious context. How do you understand why Hamas hates Jews? How do you understand why they say in their charter that it's good, the Hadith says it's right to kill the Jewish people? Why do the Sunnis hate the Shiites? Why do the Shiites hate the Sunnis? And so I think there's a whole levels of context that we need to make a complete story of what's happening in the Middle East. And I think that as Christian reporters, we need to take that as part of what informs us and how we report.
So, David, when you look at your colleagues in the foreign media, how would you view their level of education, really, of background knowledge about Israel and about the region?
First of all, I just want to respond to your first question because it's so probing and such an important question in front of this audience, because what Abbas put out there was a blood libel, which here in the region you really didn't have those in the centuries of Islamic dominance over the Jewish people. The Jewish and Christian minorities largely submitted. These types of blood libels are a Western import and a Western Christian import. And that's what makes it important for us as Christian journalists. It was actually an Italian priest serving in Damascus, 1840 or so, the first blood libel in modern times in the Middle East, a pogrom against the Jews there. And that's an important point for us. It's part of what motivates me to tell the Muslim world we got it wrong about the Jews so many times before. And we're here to tell you it's wrong, it's vile, and stop it. And, you know, there's a certain motivation and regret that Christian Europe, that sort of thing, got imported into the Middle East in modern times, conspiratorial anti-Semitism, blood libels like this. And I think that, I do think the fact that it wasn't reported, that there are foreign press here, that they didn't want to put out another example of a Palestinian leader lying because they want to protect their reputation. And I remember Saeb Erekat in the moments after word started leaking out about the battle in Jenin, 2002, and he says, massacre, massacre, at least 500 killed, and it's out there for days and days, a massacre in Jenin, and no one ever holds him accountable. The media still goes to him as a source, and, you know, there should be a label under him, you know, paid distorter or something like this. Every time Hanan Ashwari goes on, there should be a little cash register in the corner of the screen. Every time she says Israeli occupation, oh, she just got paid another $100, another $100. And I do think there is a protectionism of the Palestinian distortion among some of the mainstream media, because these are go-to sources. They want access to them. They don't want to put them in such bad lights, and therefore the story went unreported. Your question is, again?
Well, why don't I just go on, because you gave an answer to a different question, and I think you touched on something that's interesting, and so did Judy, which is the sort of herd mentality that everybody in the media opposes the Israeli government and its policy on the occupation, and the majority of the Israeli media oppose the Israeli government, which of course was democratically elected, and is in a oppositional position towards the majority of the Israeli public that cast their ballots in the Knesset election and elected the government that they elected. And I think that this is really an interesting question for Ami, because I think what I've seen with the I-24 coverage is that you're very reflective of the coverage that we receive in Yediot Achronot and in Haaretz, Channel 2, but you do it in English. And how do you view the mission of an English language Israeli station? What is the vision of I-24 in terms of their role in getting the news out about Israel to the international community?
Well, first of all, just to be clear, I'm a freelance journalist for I-24. I don't represent I-24, and my views here are my own. But if I could just add earlier to what Chris said, it's a Dinesh's point. I kind of agree with you, and I think that one of the things that, the reasons that stories like Mahmoud Abbas that you mentioned earlier are not reported on, there is some sort of certain fatigue that audiences abroad have with the occupation entering its 50th year, and certainly fatigue with some of the statements that come out of people like Mahmoud Abbas, who has said pretty outrageous things in the past, and I'm sure there's fatigue with some of the things on the Palestinian side, or how Palestinians see things that are said on the Israeli side. So bias, I guess, is in the eye of the beholder. But back to I-24, I mean, I'm not exactly clear on what, the mission statement is to bring a different kind of point of view. I would disagree, by the way, with how you frame it as, similar to what Yediot Achronot, Israel's second most widely circulated newspaper in Israel is, and Haaretz, where Judy works. I think most people would frame it as more center-right, probably more like Yisrael Hayom, which is Israel's most widely circulated newspaper and very supportive of the Prime Minister and the Likud. In fact, one example of that I could say that is many Palestinians refuse to come on I-24 as guests because they see I-24 as cooperating or collaborators with what they see as the Zionist regime. So again, it's another case, another example of bias in the eye of the beholder. But I would actually add that of all the places that I've worked in Israel, and I've worked in quite a few. I've worked in Haaretz, I've worked in Yediot, actually in Kalkalist, which is the financial daily of Yediot Achronot, as chief night editor in both cases. I-24 is one of the most mixed places I've been in. It has not only Jews from all parts of society, but many Arabs that Israeli Palestinians that work, inside Israel proper, that I did not meet when I was working in Haaretz, and that I certainly did not meet when I was working in Kalkalis, the financial daily. And those voices come out on the air. And just to add one final sentence, I think what I-24 does very well is that it also brings, it tries to bring both sides of the story, both voices. When something happens in Israel, we make a real effort to bring Israeli experts and also hear the Palestinian experts, which is something that growing up in Israel, I remember that used to happen. Watching Channel 2 and watching Channel 1, and I would see Palestinians on screen from either the Palestinian Authority or even before the Palestinian Authority was founded. And now Israeli media does not really show them on television anymore, and certainly not on in print and other venues. So I think that's something that I-24 actually still does very well.
No, and this really, what you raise is an interesting point because, of course, the Palestinian Journalists Union has, I think, 2 or 3 times voted to boycott all Israeli journalists and not allow Israeli journalists to work with them and to work inside of Ramallah. We had a whole issue just recently, remember, with Channel 2's Palestinian Affairs correspondent, where they tried to kick him out of Ramallah. And so, and this really goes to the question of bias, right? Because if what Chris was saying earlier, that there's a fatigue regarding, viciously anti-Semitic statements coming out from the mouths of the heads of the Palestinian leadership, and people don't report it because it's old news. The question is, when was it new news? And is this really fatigue? Because it's not as though these stories were reported 20 years ago either. And so, or is this simply maintaining faith with that? And I think, and I know that Judy doesn't agree that that's a bias. And so I'd like to ask you, with this, of course, leading question, and I'm sorry, is, yeah, I said Judy. So what I'd really like to know from you, and answer this obviously any way that you can or you wish, what would you view as biased? What in your view are things that are, not legitimate coverage, not right, whether it's regarding the Palestinians, whether it's regarding the Israelis, that you've seen reflected in your career, either in the Israeli media or in the foreign ministry or in the foreign media? Where would you view bias? How do you look at it?
I think where I draw the line is. Basic question, does Israel have the right to exist? Those who say Israel has no right to exist, I would say, are anti-Israel and biased against Israel. Getting back to what I mentioned earlier, those who say the occupation is something bad and needs to be ended, I don't consider them anti-Israel. I consider them maybe anti-Israeli government, maybe Israeli government policy, but I would not call them anti-Israel because, as you know, that's the editorial policy of my newspaper. And we describe ourselves, you may not agree, as a Zionist newspaper. And that's our policy. That's our editorial policy. So that's where I draw the line. Do you think Israel has the right to exist or not? Is there a need for a Jewish state?
Do you see that bias of rejecting Israel's right to exist reflected in foreign media coverage of Israel? And if so, do you think that there's been an increase in that kind of bias in recent years, or do you think it's about the same as it's always been? Do you see that as a phenomenon?
Look, I've never done a study about it. That's not my field, but I'm aware of what's out there. There's probably more of that out there now simply because of social media and all these new online sites. And there are quite a few that reject Israel's right to exist. I don't know what existed beforehand. Beforehand, we had what we were talked about earlier, mainstream press. There are many other outlets out there today. So because of that, there's probably more of it.
And how do you, Chris, view the role of Christian media is there a distinct role that the Christian media play? Is there interplay between the Christian media and the non-religious media in the West that impacts your coverage on the one hand or impacts their coverage on the other hand? How do you view that interplay in terms of this growing, perhaps as a result of social media, as Judy mentioned, salience of the narrative that actually Israel's very existence is illegitimate and should be ended?
One mission I think that I, as a bureau chief for CBN News, there is a slogan that we had many years ago called "From Information to Understanding." And you can also look in a biblical verse in 1 Chronicles that said the sons of Issachar understood the times and they knew what to do. So I think what our role sometimes is to help make sometimes a very complicated and complex region understandable so people can know what to do. I know for our audience, they want to pray, so they want to know how to pray. The interplay between myself and the non-Christian media, for example, we have friendly relations, but I think we come from a different worldview. And I think, as I mentioned, Itamar Marcus's book, Deception, I think when I came here, which was 5 weeks before the second Intifada, and then went through 3 years of suicide bombings and terror attacks on a regular basis between homework and school, one of the things that in that idea of helping people understand is to present a part of the narrative that wasn't often reported. The religious basis of the conflict, the fact that the Palestinian Authority glorifies terrorists like Dalal Mughrabi, who was responsible for the biggest terror attack against Israelis, is glorified in Palestinian society. That the refrigerator, the term for a man who used the refrigerator to kill Israelis. We have had people in our stories incognito because for what they said about the Palestinian Authority was too dangerous to say in public or to be identified. We have reported on the fact that on the Mount of Olives there's an Israeli flag flying of a man, and because that flag is flying, it was an Arab man who sold that land to Jewish people who was killed. There's a law in the Palestinian Authority that selling land to Jews you could be killed for. So part of this is to helping tell stories that aren't necessarily reported in the Western media that I think lend a whole different context to the story. And part of that is religion. And I think understanding the role of religion in the Middle East and in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is essential to understand what's really happening.
Well, that's really a good question that you raise about religion. Do you think, David, that the post-religious nature of the Western media, broad generalization, makes it more difficult for Western journalists to understand the conflict? Do you think that you can understand it if you don't understand the role that faith plays in the lives of the people of the region?
That's a very important question that just got answered to me in a very personal way, that we had someone from the Atlantic coming to report on our Feast of Tabernacles. And they haven't covered us in 20 years since the herd mentality of the Millennium Hype, and Jeffrey Goldberg came and interviewed us about all the Christian crazies coming here. So, you know, I'm a little reluctant, you know, a liberal magazine, but very respected literary journal, sending a reporter. It happens to be a young reporter from a Jewish background who says she wants to address this very problem in her reporting, and she's doing fantastic reporting. She was doing a lot of the reporting on the evangelical support for Trump, and as we read through her articles and decided, you know, to give her access to the feast, to talk to her, engage with her, interested in what turns out, you saw that if you, you know, really did or said something that deserved criticism, it was there. But she says, I think that faith still motivates people and drives people, their actions, their views and all, far more than the media, the mainstream media, understands itself. And she wants to be fair in presenting that. And I just thought it was a, you know, an exception, a wonderful exception. You look at her writing, the Atlantic is, you know, high literary standard. And here's a young reporter, you know, going back to the old way it was done, really getting what really is the basis of your views, your worldview, and how does that impact your view of this conflict. And I think that most reporters ignore it completely. And to understand this conflict, it's a religious conflict, and it's a spiritual conflict. It's a moral conflict, as we've been saying. And if you ignore that, then you're ignoring the heart of it.
So, Ami, you know, we've seen the Israeli government sort of waking up over the past 17 years, really, since Chris has been here, to this issue of difficulties explaining Israel's position on counterterrorism, on war, on settlements, on whatever. How do you think they're doing today? Do you think that there's been an improvement? Do you think, I mean, look at it, like from 360, you know, from you know, top of a mountain, when you're looking down as somebody who's been in this trade for a while, do you see any learning curve? Do you see, and then after you sort of diagnose how you view the government, we're here in the government press office thing, so they should care. Do you think that it has mattered? Whether, you know, if you say yes, has it changed the coverage at all that Israel is doing more?
I don't think it's changed the coverage. I think it's a real uphill battle for the GPO. First thing I want to say is, look, we were talking before, and I think we heard also with Mati Friedman as well, but here as well about the narratives that are changing and the narratives that are being adopted, and adding on top of that the fatigue that we talked about earlier, where fatigue not only from the Israeli-Palestinian story, but I think if we're talking about the American market, fatigue from basically anything that has to do with foreign news, international news, less interest, less bureaus open abroad, less reporting in general. Less money. I totally agree with that. But back to the narrative, I think what we're seeing more is, and it's not necessarily media bias, it's just that we're seeing over the years the Palestinian narrative is being adopted more in the American market, not only by, you know, general Americans, but even by Jewish Americans, and particularly young Jewish Americans, millennial Jews, who feel less of a connection to Israel as their parents did, who will probably in the future donate a lot less money than their parents did to Israel, and this is a problem for Israel, I think, that Israel is looking into. And the problem is that the narrative is that Israel is not seen as favorably as it was a few decades ago as the victim. And people are starting to understand that, well, there might be another victim in this story now. And I think maybe people look at Israel as you know, the cool kid in the class who kind of maybe turned into a bully. And now we have to think about Israel a bit differently. And that's a hard thing, I think, for the GPO, or for any what we call here in Israel hasbara, which translates to public diplomacy. Thank you. It's a very tough thing to tackle. Personally, I don't think the Israeli Hasbara efforts are really going that well, and I think I don't know if it's destined to fail, but it's definitely a very uphill battle. It's very difficult.
Yeah. Carolyn, can I ask?
Yeah.
Add something about the Palestinian narrative? I think part of the reason the West doesn't get the entire story is the intimidation sometimes in Palestinian areas. I can remember an instance. I came here in August of 2000. When 9/11 happened, there were rallies in Palestinian towns and cities that were videotaped by Western media. And then that video was confiscated, and under pain of death threats, these reporters did not release the footage. I remember Renan Giesen at the time, who was the spokesperson for Ariel Sharon, begging, trying to get this footage, and they wouldn't release it because they knew that these reporters and the camera crews were under fear of their death.
Well, we only have to remember, I'll just add to that, Riccardo Cristiani, if you guys heard about him, he was the Italian cameraman for, I think it might have been, what? RAI, yes, network in Italy, and he was the one who brought the footage of the lynch of the IDF reservists in Ramallah in October 2000, just 17 years ago this month. And he brought the pictures of the Palestinian mob lynching our soldiers that were then broadcast worldwide. And he had to, I think, be spirited out of the country. And he issued an abject apology to Yasser Arafat for having filmed the event, and RAI apologized to the Palestinian Authority for having broadcast the footage. And so, and on the other hand, right, if you take another event that happened the same week, which was the shooting event at Summit, what was it, Gush Katif, the Gush Katif junction in Gaza, where you had Muhammad al-Dura, a Palestinian child, and his father being caught in a shooting crossfire between Palestinian gunmen and IDF soldiers, and al-Dura being killed purportedly by the IDF, although later on the IDF investigation showed that there was actually no way for the child to have been killed by our soldiers. But that footage was given out by France 2, by Second Channel in France, for free to every single media organization in the world, and it was broadcast 24/7, essentially for months and years afterwards. I mean, not years afterwards, but for a long, long period. And it became the fodder for blood libels. It appeared in the decapitation video of Daniel Pearl in Pakistan 2 years later, and in many other suicide videos as well. So, we have a situation, and it was that apology that he ran away from the country, and he apologized in writing, and it was published in the Al-Hayat Al-Jadida, the PA's official organ, and RAI apologized. So, I mean, these are exactly, another brutal example of what you're discussing.
And it just goes the last couple of years. I know Mati, who was just here, wrote about this in the 2014 war against Hamas, where a number of journalists inside Gaza Strip had to leave, were forced out by Hamas because they were reporting on either mortars or rockets that were fired beside their hotel. And in that war, you hardly see any Hamas fighters. They were ghosts.
Can I just play the devil's advocate for a second? Because unfortunately, and this is my critique to the GPO, if we were talking about, Nitzan, I'm glad you're here, it would have been nice if we're talking about media bias in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to have maybe a Palestinian journalist on this panel and talk about that as well. Unfortunately, there is none. But if I could just, say that there are stories of intimidation inside the West Bank of foreign journalists. I think the Foreign Press Association has complained a few times, and of course of restriction of movement to Palestinian journalists. Palestinian journalists also have their issues with the Israeli military rule. I think that's important that we should point that out. There's also recently the GPO involved in another story where involving Al Jazeera and some threats by the Israeli Communication Ministry that it might be shut down, and there's critique if this might be, so you're grinning at me, I don't know if that was a good thing to bring up, but hey, I brought it up, that it might be shut down, and there's critique that, first of all, that some of their reporters are engaged in incitement. There's also critique on the other side that this might be, shutting down freedom of speech and journalism, freedom of the press in Israel. So, again, I'm just trying to bring in everything on this.
Sure. Yeah, I think you can make a good distinction between Israeli censorship on the one side, the military censor especially for various, I think, good reasons, and Palestinian forceful coercion on the other side, where even, when the BBC has one of their journalists, Alan Johnston, kidnapped by Hamas, that has to affect your reporting on what's happening here. And on the Israeli side, I've actually seen the censorship imposed in an incredibly humanitarian way that, back to the Jenin massacre, the Israeli people get rumors that something bad has happened in Jenin that morning. The Palestinian spokesmen are on all the TV saying massacre, massacre, massacre. The Israeli military censors told the Israeli press you cannot report on this yet because these were reservist soldiers who had died in a double suicide bombing by women and with their children with them that morning, and they had to inform their wives and children, their families. And you're sitting all day, you knew something had happened, you start getting wind of this ambush in the closed streets of Jenin, and you want to report what's happened, but you cannot until all the families are informed, and the lie is already around the world before the truth gets its pants on.
So, yes, I wanted you to come in actually after Ami. So,
no,
yes.
I just wanted to inject a little balance. I think there's lying that goes on both sides, and two recent incidents that come to my mind where the Israeli government itself lied, and I don't think we've yet heard an apology. I think it was about a year ago. We had the huge fires, remember? Burnt down tons of forests in the Carmel. And do you remember who was being blamed for those fires? Okay, have we heard any apology? Have we had any evidence? And Arabs. Which minister was it who said? Okay, there's Arabs who set those fires. We still, as far as I know, nobody's yet been arrested for doing that. The other example that comes to mind is
there were a couple instances where it actually happened that way.
As the other incident that comes to mind was in Rahat a couple months ago, where a Bedouin man driving a car was accused of being a terrorist, and again, Gilad Ardan said he was a terrorist, and he was shot, and he was justified shooting him. Then it turned out that basically he was innocent. He lost control of the car after his car was shot. So I'm saying these lies go on both sides,
it was interesting. I was speaking with a colleague the other day about the debate in the United States regarding America's or President Trump's decision to decertify Iranian compliance with the nuclear deal that Obama concluded with the Iranian regime in 2015. And one of the things that was really stuck out in people's mind was that former senior military officials and intelligence officials from Israel were weighing in on the discussion and lobbying Congress to oppose decertification of Iranian compliance, which is interesting because it was a 180-degree departure from the position of the Israeli government. And so I think that, you know, there's a significant question about whether people using their past jobs in the military should be trying to push a foreign policy that's different from that of the government. But there is also an issue, as Judy mentioned at the outset, of the worldview of a lot of Israeli journalists. And we're an open democracy. And so you don't get a party line in Israel the way that you do in Russia, or Soviet Union anyway, and largely in Russia today, or China, or Saudi Arabia, or the Palestinian Authority, or any of these places that are ruled by authoritarian governments. We are an open society. Everybody can go out and speak to anybody here about what they view regarding the Palestinians, regarding Iran, regarding women's rights, regarding anything. And so I'd like to actually pose this question to Judy and to Ami and say, you know, what do you think of the question of whether, I mean, whether the bias, if there is one, or to the extent that you recognize that there is one regarding Israel, just as a function of the fact that we're an open society and everybody gets to grab a microphone anytime he or she can, certainly on social media and anywhere else. How does that play into the fact that we're a democracy, into the debate that we have here and the debate about Israel abroad? Who wants to go first? I want both of you. Both of you.
I'm trying to think. Well, I think it's great that we're a democracy, and the fact that, and you're right, the fact that we're a democracy allows journalists covering this place to get more voices, and sometimes very different voices into their stories. And maybe some people are uncomfortable with some of the voices that get into their stories. So the question is, should we stop those voices, and should we clamp down on the free press in Israel? And obviously, I don't think we should. So, yeah, but I just wanted to mention something else about bias. You mentioned before Palestinian journalists declaring a boycott of Israeli journalists.
Right.
And who was it who said here, was it you, Ami, that, that some Palestinians don't want to appear on I-24 because they consider it part of the Zionist regime. So, I mean, this may be surprising for some of you to hear, but I've had the same issue at Haaretz. Also, on the one hand, with Palestinians, I go to Ramallah occasionally, and very often if I identify as a reporter for Haaretz, which despite its leftist orientation is still considered by many Palestinians to be part of the Zionist regime, and they won't speak to me. And at the same time, if I go a few kilometers away to the settlement of Beit El, there are people there who will not speak to me because I'm from Haaretz. So I get it from both sides. And
I'll just add to the issue of media bias, and I think it's kind of the first question that you asked Judy when we started this panel.
I was asking about the fact that we have a free press enabling, facilitating, or standing, you know, as one of the roots of the kind of coverage that Israel receives versus, say, China.
You mean the free press is the reason that Israel is critiqued?
But this is a positive reason for Israel being critiqued, not a negative one. You know,
Right.
that this is a function of the nature of Israel as an open society.
I agree. It's a function of Israel as a democracy, as an open society. I think maybe even I've heard colleagues from European countries say they feel freer to critique Israel because of the similarities, because of the they feel that a brotherhood of Western civilization here. So is that? Would I prefer it the other way? Would I prefer a less free press like in China? Of course not, or even what happens to it in our neighbors. But just, if I may, add about media bias, and and how Israel is covered in the world. Look, I'm not that much of a consumer as I used to be of international media because I live here and I don't get a lot of the stations except for CNN and Fox and some of the major cable companies. I don't think there is some sort of institutionalized bias against Israel, even the BBC, which has a really bad name here in Israel. I mean, when you say, I just want you to know, when you say the BBC here in Israel, people, it's like they shudder. And Israeli media latches on to every case or every headline that the BBC or Reuters or CNN on their websites got wrong. And I think, by the way, we should bring up also the fact that this is the issue that we talked about, the digital era, that a lot of these headlines are on websites, not necessarily in print, or sometimes it's all done very quickly. It's about getting the headline very quickly out there, and sometimes, as a person who used to work in the newsroom and also see the people that work in the web newsroom, not only the people that work in the newsroom are very young folks, the people that work in the websites are even younger and even less experienced, and they just want to be first. And you know what? There are definitely isolated incidents of people getting headlines horribly wrong. I mean, atrociously wrong. Sometimes they've been corrected. Most of the time they've been corrected. I think sometimes there have been apologies. I don't know, maybe the BBC has apologized or not. Excuse me? It happens all the time.
Yeah.
And other countries. Well, I disagree.
Well, let me just bring in two notable examples, because I don't think that Israel and Israelis get angry every time that this happens. I think that there are significant instances when it happens when Israel gets very angry, or Israeli media gets up on its hind legs and gets angry. And I'll just give two, and I don't think that this would have happened in Las Vegas. I don't think that this would have happened in San Bernardino or Barcelona or anywhere else, which is that in November of 2015, there was a massacre of rabbis in prayer at a synagogue here in Jerusalem. And CNN's headline of it, I don't even remember what the exact headline was anymore, but it basically was a denial that it was a terrorist attack, and they counted the terrorists who were literally butchering these men as among the dead, as if there was no distinction between them and their victims. And then another one, of course, was, well, obviously you brought up the Jenin massacre, right? The massacre that never happened, and that was just thrown out not only by Saeb Erekat on CNN, but also by Kofi Annan, the General Secretary of the UN. And then we had the massacre of the Fogel family, which wasn't reported as a massacre, which wasn't reported as a terrorist attack.
It was hardly reported.
It was hardly reported. I mean, this was a family, 3 children and their parents, including a 3-month-old baby who was decapitated in their homes while they were sleeping. And it was barely reported in the media. The same thing, of course, happened this past summer with the Salomon family in Neve Tzuf, who was also massacred on a Friday evening. So I think that, you know, it's and then the final one I'll just give out there, because I think it's worth recalling, is in October 2000, there was a picture on the front page of the New York Times in the print edition of an Israeli border guard looking very, very angry, holding up his gun with a bloody young man with blood falling down his face and onto his shirt. And the caption read, Israeli soldier attacking Palestinians in Jerusalem. And they received a letter to the editor from a man in Chicago who said, that picture was a picture of my son, Tuvia Grossman, who had just been attacked by a mob on his way to his yeshiva in the old city in Jerusalem, and that border guard was protecting him. He managed to crawl to him, and Tuvia Grossman spent the next year in the hospital recuperating from the wounds that he received that day at the hands of a lynch mob that nearly killed him. And this was totally amazing because it was the decision of a photo editor not only to run the picture, but to assume a story relating to that picture that was entirely wrong and made up, and that couldn't possibly have been an innocent mistake of a 21-year-old making minimum wage running headlines for CNN. This was a deliberate decision on the part of the newsroom to misinterpret this image. And so, I understand the desire to believe that there isn't something going on here, but I think that it's very difficult to do. And again, I don't think that Israelis are looking at CNN and other major news organizations with anything like the intensity that you sort of laid out.
So when a headline like that happens on CNN, for example, the example you brought about the rabbis in Jerusalem, what do you think was the motivation? I mean, if it's not a mistake, it is?
No, I think it was a mistake, but the mistake was based upon an internalization of a narrative. That it's a narrative that denies the terrorist nature of violence against Israeli Jews, and that was automatically expressed. That if there are a lot of things like, if you look at a traffic accident, right?
Carolyn, can I ask?
Yeah.
You're the moderator. Let us.
I'm
speak.
sorry. No, but I mean, he asked me a question. I think that was a function of an. But now, yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Can I just inject that Israeli democracy is very robust, very diverse, very energetic. It's reflected in the media. It's a free press, all kinds of spectrums. I think it's important to note for our Christian media here from abroad, there's an interesting dynamic in the way the foreign media report from here, that if you're in the U.S., the big major media based in New York, there's been studies that show they all follow the lead of the front pages of the New York Times. And here in Israel, there's no doubt that the foreign media pays attention to how the Israeli media is reporting a story. And that a paper like Haaretz, which might not have the circulation of a Yediot, Afronot, and Ma'ariv, sometimes they look more as tabloids. Haaretz is a serious paper. And a lot of the journalists follow it, so it's a important...
And it comes out in English.
And they have an English version. In fact, the English version comes out with the New York Times here every day. When you buy the Times, you get Haaretz. So it puts a important responsibility on Haaretz, how they report it, because it has a knock-on effect. I'll just say, for Judy, from what I've seen, she's always been fair. I wouldn't have any complaints about you, the sorts of beats that you follow, but there was an editor of Haaretz at one time who was quoted from a dinner in very crude terms, saying he wished the U.S. would come and forcibly rape Israel into withdrawing from the territories. And that sort of editorial bias, I believe it has an effect on how the foreign media reports the story from here. Even though Haaretz does very good reporting and covers stories that a lot of the other Israeli press doesn't cover, that I think is important for Israel's moral conscience.
Caroline, if I could add something.
Yeah, you can add something, and then I would think we should get a couple of questions.
What I wanted to add is sort of go out into the broader Middle East, and since we're in a room of Christian broadcasters from around the world, I just think it's important that we remember the brothers and sisters, persecuted Christians in the Middle East, that I believe sometimes is underreported, and we need to tell their story here in the Middle East, because that's certainly part of the context and part of this whole idea of having religion as one of the contexts. And one underreported story I know too is the fact that, believe it or not, the fastest growing church in the world is in Iran, where many former Muslims dissatisfied with Islam are coming to faith in Jesus Christ. And so I think it's important we as Christian broadcasters remember what's happening here in the Middle East, what happened with ISIS and other groups that persecute them. I just came back from Kurdistan, and many Christians are trying to trickle back into towns and villages that were decimated and destroyed by ISIS, and they face an uphill battle. Many have left. Probably most Christians, there were 1.3 to 4 million Christians in Iraq in 2003, now maybe less than 300,000, and those 300,000 are in dire straits. And so we need to tell their story so people can pray for them, so people can take action and advocate on their behalf.
Okay, let's take a couple of questions from the audience. Yes, sir, you. Does he need a microphone? Oh, she's bringing you one.
Yeah, this is a question for Judy. One of the problems that I see is that there's oftentimes when articles are covered in Hebrew and Haaretz, and then they are translated into English, we see a huge discrepancy between the content of the two stories. And typically one of the things that we see is that essentially the English version has a tendency to highlight, or actually in some instances invent, Israeli wrongdoing, and then downplay Palestinian hostility or violence. And it's actually become a meme and an important theme in Israeli discourse here that we've seen. For example, at one point there was some Israelis who set a bonfire for one of the festivals in an olive grove, and that was how it was covered in the Hebrew version of the story. But when it was translated into English, it was Israeli settlers torch a Palestinian olive grove. And this basically is used as fodder by anti-Zionist activists throughout the world.
I've heard these allegations before. It's not the first time. I think it's very rare that something like that happens. Usually we try, as a matter of policy, to stay as close as possible to the Hebrew text when we're translating from the Hebrew. Sometimes there are differences in the headlines, but that has more to do with the fact that certain words in Hebrew don't work in English, or our readers abroad may not understand certain terms that readers here would know. So without getting into any specific article, I would say that there's certainly no deliberate policy at Haaretz of highlighting Israel's wrongdoings in the English translations of our stories from the Hebrew Haaretz.
Okay, yes, you in the second row.
I'm a lobbyist inside the European Parliament. Obviously, I follow the Israeli news. One story that I didn't see covered very much was there was a Christian tourist, if you remember, 2 years ago. Okay, sorry. There was a Christian tourist, black tourist from France, and he was beaten up at the Temple Mount. I'm not sure if you are aware of the case or not. He had blood covered his face, and basically, I think, Judy, your newspaper, I don't think, I was just Googling, I don't think even covered it at all. If it was the other way around, he was attacked by Muslim people at the Temple Mount. And basically, some newspapers are covered, international media did it. And when we're referring to the bias, I mean, if it was the other way around, if it was somebody from an Islamic background being attacked at the Western Wall or attacked at Vatican, it would have really made the headlines. So I don't know why your newspaper didn't feel it was worth it to be covered.
Are you sure? You said you don't think that we covered it. Are you sure that?
I just tried to Google it and to see if it was...
I mean, it seems to me that that's a story we would cover. And if we didn't, I really don't know why it wasn't covered. But that would be a story we would cover.
Okay, well, listen, I think that, the issue of bias or non-bias regarding foreign media coverage, and by the way, Israeli media coverage, of Israel as a whole and aspects of our lives here specifically is a very broad one. And I hope that we covered today the issue of faith and whether it exists, what is bias, and whether even at its most distilled in its most distilled form it is reflected in coverage of Israel or not, and how social media impacts this. And we also talked broadly about whether Israel's public diplomacy efforts to shape the narrative about Israel is working or are not working, and other issues. Obviously, we're not going to get either to a consensus because, as we discussed, the fact that Israel is a free media market and an open society also ensures that there won't be a consensus regarding this country, and that's fantastic. Obviously, these are kinds of things that play into media coverage that we should all, as journalists, be aware of when we come to cover Israel and issues related to the Middle East more broadly. So I hope that we've piqued your curiosity and your thinking process on this, and I'm sure that people here would be happy to take questions privately. Thank you.